Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your Sweep Union, and in this one, there are several advances across the eastern section of the Donetsk region, where the Russians have managed to advance in numerous areas to the northeast of Liman, to the east of the city, in the northern flank of Siversk, and to the east and southeast of Koshchentinivka. With no Ukrainian advances over the past 24 hours, the Russians have managed to now operationally encircle and physically encircle two groupings of Ukrainian forces in the vicinity of Liman. Starting out in the Liman direction and Siversk directions, the Russians have managed to make several advances here to the east and northeast of the city. To the northeast of Liman, the Russians have managed to gain control over the northern parts of Sarishne. With this, they have operationally encircled the Ukrainian forces in Mirne and in the fortified positions north of Sarishne. The Ukrainians do not have any stable supply line to and from Mirne except for this off-road which they have been using to supply their forces in that direction. The Ukrainians are now unable to resupply their forces in the direction of Mirne as the Russians have direct fire control over the road leading into the settlement and the surrounding fortified positions. However, we may be seeing a withdrawal of Ukrainian forces, which would have to fight against the Russian forces on the flanks to withdraw from these positions and back away from Sarishne. With the capture of the northern parts of Sarishne, it's only a matter of time before the Russians gain control over Mirne and continue offensive operations in the southern direction to gain control over the fortified positions on the flanks of Sarishne, which will secure the eastern flank of Liman in favor of the Russians. The Russians also continued offensive operations in the direction of Yampil, where geolocated footage confirms Russian presence in the northeastern parts of it. At the same time, the Russians continued offensive operations on the northern flank of Siversk. The Russians have now reached deep into the flank of Siversk, where they've managed to reach the roads here connecting to the small residential area along the Siversk-Donetsk river line. The Ukrainian forces who have survived the Battle of the Srebrensk Forest area and withdrawn to the southern flanks along the border between the Luhansk and Donetsk regions would have withdrawn to this small residential area near Serebrenka. Combined with the recent Ukrainian counterattacks in the direction of Serebrenka itself, the Ukrainians are now encircled in this whole area, as the Russians have now managed to reach the sole supply line leading into these areas. This means that the Ukrainian forces operating within the direction of Serebrenka and the Srebrensk Forest area are now physically cut off with the Russian presence within the residential area here to the west of Serebrenka. And with Russian presence that deep into the Ukrainian positions, it is likely that the Russians have consolidated at these positions following the geolocated footage from a few days ago where the Russians were present within the abandoned industrial area here to the north of Siversk, which would also mean that they have secured the road into the industrial area, where we see the fortified positions are in a straight line. The Russians likely infiltrated the defensive line, pushed through it from the side, overcoming their fortifications by attacking their weak points and slowly pushing through these fortifications along their weak points, gain control over the flank of it, leading to the second defensive line, the industrial area, and now the residential area to the west of Srebrenka, where the Ukrainian forces are encircled. From this, we can see, following the capture of the Srebrensk Forest area, the Russians have now encircled Ukrainian forces north of Siversk and in the Mirne direction. The Ukrainian forces here in the Liman direction are clearly overstretched across the front line with not enough forces to deal with the Russian offensive operations. And with the Russian encirclements happening one after another, especially in the Srebrensk Forest area, these defenses have been further weakened. Now the final defensive positions of the Ukrainians in the Siversk and Liman directions are being threatened, as the Russians are bypassing some of these defensive positions of the Ukrainians in these sectors of the front line. The bypass of the fortified positions north of Siversk and encirclement of the Ukrainian grouping in that direction opens the road for the Russian forces on the northern flank, gaining control of the remaining parts of Serebrenka and pushing in the western direction to then push on the supply lines of the Ukrainians to the west of the town with their combined efforts from the south of Siversk It's only a matter of time before the Siversk town itself is operationally encircled, with Russians attacking the supply lines and gaining fire control over the remaining roads. Similar thing in the Liman direction, although the Russians aren't as developed in that section as they are in the Siversk direction. The Russians are getting closer and closer with the fighting in the direction of Novoselivka, Dobryshevo, Stavki, and Sarishne, as well as Yampil to the east, north, and northwest. The Russians are slowly gaining full control over the flanks and supply lines leading into Liman, which would then allow them to gain control over the settlement and establish it as a logistical hub for their forces. Gaining control over Liman and Siversk significantly bolsters the Russian offensive capabilities along the Oski River line and the Seversk-Donetsk River line on the northern and eastern flank of the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line. Speaking of the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line, the Russians continued offensive operations to the southeast of the city as well as on the southern flank. To the southeast, the Russians continued offensive operations along the Dacha area and have gained full control over the road between Alexandro-Shultina and the Dacha area, allowing for additional supply lines to those forward positions, combined with their capture of the fortified positions in between Alexandro-Shultina and Predeshina, and the now capture of the fortified positions along the second supply road. Russians now have control over two supply routes into the Dacha area, which is then connected to the city itself. At the same time, the Russians have now gained control over the road between Yablonivka in the west and Katerinivka in the east, where they are looking to gain full control over the southern bank of the reservoir and the remaining parts along the Klibenbik and Shivka directions, as well as the fortified positions along the dam. Gaining control over all of these positions significantly bolsters the Russian positions here to the southeast of Konstantinivka and allows the Russians to develop offensive operations from the Donetsk direction towards the city itself. The Russians have strong logistics in this section of the front line, with Orlivka connected to the city of Donetsk, connected to Toretsk, and then onwards to the front line, as well as the connection to Bakhmut in the northeast. The Russians are well supplied in this section. However, the Konstantinivka-Sloviansk line is very powerful as well, which hinders Russian significant advances. However, as we see both in the Liman, Siversk, and now Konstantinivka directions, the Ukrainian positions are weakened because they are dedicating their offensive capabilities elsewhere in the direction of the northern flank of Pokrovsk. At the same time, international media have now reported that Donald Trump received a request from Zelensky during his meeting with him that Ukraine now needs intelligence support for an upcoming offensive against Russia. The intelligence support is very necessary from the United States because the other countries that are supporting Ukraine, all of the European nations, do not have nearly the same capabilities as the United States. Without the United States support capabilities, they would not know where the Russian groupings of forces are, where Russian equipment is stationed, where the reserves are, the logistical hubs of the Russian forces, and everything else needed to know ahead of such an operation that is large in scale. Despite the failure of the first incursion by the Ukrainians are now planning yet another offensive. We're seeing that the United States switched the idea, saying that Ukraine can probably retake all of their territory. Although it is completely unrealistic that that happens, this switch also indicates that there is an idea for Ukraine recapturing all of its territory. If we take a look at this offensive operations through those lenses, and based on the negotiations so far, the idea of switching territory for territory is a viable one as well. Based on that, we can determine two things. First of all, is that it is not necessarily territory that the Russians have captured from the Ukrainians that needs to be recaptured during those offensives. So we may see another Kursk, Belgorod, or Bryansk offensive. And the second thing is, based on what we have seen over the past years of the battles, the war, that the Russians and the Ukrainians for such an operation needs a large concentration of forces. Now, to determine these locations, we have to look at the logistics. The logistics of the Kursk version is simply the city of Sumy in control over Sochia, then allowed Sochia to act as a logistical hub for the offensive operations going in the different directions. Now, the Russians have significantly bolstered their defensive fortifications within the Kursk region and have a significant concentration of forces alongside the border area, and not just the Kursk region, but also the Belgorod and Bryansk regions have seen a significant bolstering in the number of Russian personnel in those areas. On top of that, they also have a very powerful logistics in those directions. This means that these areas of the front line are less likely to be attacked compared to last year. Instead, what we are seeing is that the areas where the Russians are the most overstretched are in the Pokrovsk direction, as well as the Liman direction, where they are developing these offensive operations but have not yet succeeded in capturing the logistical hubs. Before the Russians capture Liman and before the Russians capture Pokrovsk, these areas are very vulnerable. A Ukrainian counterattack in the direction of Pokrovsk could be successful from the Dnipropetrovsk direction along the highway towards Pokrovsk, counterattacking in this direction to regain control over the positions in the near vicinity, where the Ukrainians have several logistical hubs and the Russians' supply lines are spread thinly. The Ukrainians could counterattack on the flanks of Pokrovsk to regain control over some of these positions, take the Russians away from areas where they have spread out and thin supply lines that can easily be overcome by a well armed and well supplied grouping of forces. An area like Kashinivka would be unrealistic as Russians have full control over Donetsk, New York, and the settlements to the north along the Kryvyi River, which means that the Russian forces here now have a solid position. While the Liman direction is similar to the Pokrovsk direction, where all of their logistics have to go through this Serebets river line, this means a Ukrainian counterattack on the flanks would be able to regain control over the river line itself and encircle the Russian forces. So these areas are more likely to see some localized Ukrainian counterattacks. As for a large-scale one, there are no areas along the front line, as we've seen both with the 2023 summer offensive and the Kursk incursion, where the Ukrainians simply can take control of a vast area and hold on to those positions, as the Russians simply have more firepower and manpower. What they need to achieve is a local collapse of Russian forces or to overcome the Russian battle of attrition. Both of these at this stage are unreasonable due to the large concentration of Russian forces all across the front line. With 700,000 troops covering the entire front line, the Russians have more than enough soldiers to plug any gaps. To have a successful offensive by the Ukrainians, they would either need to overcome the battle of attrition or to have a highly mobile, aggressive force that can not just break through the initial Russian lines, but also overwhelm the Russian secondary and third lines, where the Russian forces in reserve do not have enough time to establish the next offensive line before the forces move on to the next position, similar to the Kharkiv direction where the Ukrainians launched their counterattack in 2022. However, again, this is also unrealistic due to the Russian Air Force. The Russian Air Force is able to properly support these Russian forces when they are preparing and preventing a large-scale Ukrainian counterattack, especially also with the Russian helicopter support with the Ka-52 Alligator helicopters. They're able to attack these armored vehicles while they are on the move. This raises the question, what exactly is the Ukrainian plan? They have attempted several things, yet none have been successful since 2022. Successful meaning not just gaining territory, but also holding on to them. I really cannot find out or figure out what the Ukrainian plan is at all. All I can say is, if I personally had a say, I would say Ukraine should negotiate and end the war. Just as I said in summer of 2023, my position has not changed from 2 years ago. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.